We are really excited for our next session, which is one of the highlight sessions of the day, which is our panel discussion, all about building, managing, and evolving design systems. Jen, are you stoked about it?
Yeah, I'm so excited, and so excited to introduce the moderator for the panel, Kyle Peatt, Director of UX at Shopify. He helps teams across content, research, design, and front-end development think about the problems facing Shopify's million-plus merchants. He also enjoys a good game of Crib. Kyle likes problems. The trickier the problem, the better. Thanks so much, Kyle.
No problem. Thanks for the intro, Jen. So thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm super excited about this panel. I think we've got a good group of people here to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is building, managing, and evolving design systems. No small thing. You know, any one of those is probably a panel on its own, but we're going to get all three in this one. So the way this is going to work is I've prepared a bunch of questions for the panel, but this is meant to be conversational, both with the panel and with everybody listening. So if you've got questions, please use the question tab to stick them in, and those are going to be coming through to me, and I'll be passing those to the panel as we get them. Our intention today is really just to have a really great conversation about design systems and how they work. And the best way to start having a good conversation is, I guess, to get to know the people that are doing it. So first of all, we have Alexis, and I didn't clarify how to pronounce your last name. Actually, Alexis, do you want to give us your last name?
Yeah, Lucio. Thank
Lucio,
you.
perfect. Alexis Lucio is the inclusion design lead at Splunk. She works in San Francisco, and she works there to bring equitable and accessible practices into Splunk's overall product strategy. So I did a little bit of research on Alexis before this, and I found two fun things. Couldn't find that much other stuff, so I just got fun things. One is that she's an award-nominated costume designer, which is very cool. And she also recently gave her father a flat top haircut. How'd it turn out? Not great. Okay.
I mean, enough that he's willing for me to get a second chance, but
nice.
It's hard
Perfect.
when your dad is a barber. So
yeah, I'm just leaving the haircut by the side for now.
Yeah, and Kyle, one thing I want to mention in terms of inclusion is also doing a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you live from Los Angeles, California, which is where the Tongva tribe and other indigenous tribes were. So just want to acknowledge that, and thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So Laura is our next panelist. Laura's a fellow Canadian, which is fantastic. Based in Toronto, working at the Loblaw Digital as the Director of Product Design for PC Optimum. So Laura messaged me to tell me that she considers herself an accidental expert in systems. And I think that she can probably attribute that to a career working from agencies through to banks, where I'm sure she's encountered lots of legacy systems. And now in the product design world at one of the largest grocery store and supermarket chains in Canada. So thanks for joining us, Laura.
Thanks.
We also have Max. So Max Ignatyev, is that right?
Yep.
Didn't ask you, sorry. Is the founder and chief technology officer at Sympli.io. So that's a collaboration tool that helps bring designers and developers closer together. And Max is fun because he's an engineer on a panel about design systems, but Max is actually my favorite kind of engineer. He's the kind who dedicates themselves to making the gap between design and development ever smaller, which I really appreciate. That's something that's I care a lot about, so that's great. Max, is it true that you live in Washington, DC?
Yeah, I live in Washington suburbs, so it's actually, technically it's Maryland.
Nice, okay. But you are from Northern Siberia.
Oh yeah, like from the very, very northern one, like subarctics.
Nice, okay. So the fact that spring is just coming to Ottawa is not something I should feel too bad about.
Yeah. It's like probably coming to the place where I'm from like in a month or so.
Okay, right on. So I have an icebreaker question for us. Just to, before we start talking about design systems, why not talk about ourselves a little bit? What is one hobby that you either started, picked up, rekindled, continued during this this stay-at-home process? And we'll start with Laura.
That's because you saw my face.
Yeah.
Oh, a hobby I started. I guess I play a lot of Animal Crossing, but I don't try very hard and I don't accomplish very much. I just kind of putter around. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to keep playing it by the time I'm allowed out of the house. No,
I was going to ask how much bells are on your island right now.
A reasonable amount, but I feel like I'm really not keeping up with everyone else.
How about you, Alexis?
First off, friend codes at the end of this panel, because also getting into Animal Crossing. One hobby that I've picked up and getting reacquainted with is actually cooking. I find cooking as a decompressor, mainly because I find it to be all the 5 love languages. Like, it's super tactile, to feel the smells, to hear things cooking, like to show affection and love in food. So learning different languages, as I like to say, different cuisines, and like just learning how cultures explore love and tradition and history through food.
Nice.
And it's
what was
delicious.
the last thing you cooked?
I did a mapo tofu recipe from Chef Melissa King from Top Chef.
Sounds good.
Then did a lotus root stir fry. My parents are not used to Asian food, so they were like, okay. And I was like, it's okay. No refunds, because you didn't pay for it.
What about you, Max?
2 things. Actually, I discovered what is the proper term for it? It's probably called online fitness thing. Like when you actually watch people on TV, plug your TV in and do the fitness stuff. You work out at home. So my wife and I, we've been doing it like 5 days a week at least.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I learned my first like full guitar solo. Like it's a Nothing Else Matters solo by Metallica. I'm pretty proud of myself.
Are you going to give us a little rendition later?
No, like it's not. I think it's not a comedy contest here, so I'll rather skip on that.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, guys. The first question I've got is about starting somewhere, and I guess this panel has to start somewhere. So let's talk about that too. So I'm curious, given your experience with systems, what is the best piece of advice that you can give the people listening today to help them advocate for starting a design system at their company that are just starting off at the beginning of their journey, maybe are trying to convince stakeholders or the company that's really a great idea for them to start a design system? Maybe we can start with you, Alexis.
Sure, and this one's near and dear to my heart because a little bit about me, I graduated in industrial design, ended up being a kids' toy designer, switched into UX design for 4 years, and then switched into accessibility design. So at my last company, I was the first and only designer and ended up advocating for a design system and getting resources from PM and then working with engineering. And what I found to be the #1 best tactic was just to become a master at communicating the value of design systems in as many different ways as possible. I find that especially in larger companies, designers often work in silos or isolation, and they're very good at articulating in a design language, but not necessarily one that can be as translatable, especially around the ROI, to marketing, PM, docs, engineering, C-suite. And if you think about it, you're competing for resources at the end of the day. So you've got to be able to justify the why. And I found that having more partners on my side who are on the same team had us progressing much farther than I could ever imagine. And then once you get that little taste of ROI and seeing how, easy or faster to production or less bugs, it gets people really excited. So again, like, make sure you're not getting lost in translation and you're not just speaking your own design-centric language, but that you can appeal to different audiences within your company.
Yeah, that makes sense. Laura, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think my advice is to just start. I think it's really, really easy for people to be intimidated by the amount of work that could potentially go to it, especially if you're dealing with a legacy system or you're trying to document something that exists that's massive. But just start somewhere and just start doing it off the side of your desk if you have to. Once you start doing it, it's really easy to prove the value across different disciplines by having everything in one place. Even if it's not all the disciplines and it's just design, I think getting something out there and getting something done is the hardest part for a lot of people, but it's important to remember that these things are being built to change anyway. So it's never going to be perfect.
So it sounds like there's a difference between articulating the value to like other designers. So if maybe you're trying to get designers on board with why they should use the design system that you're putting together versus working with other disciplines. Like Max, have you run into a different way of communicating the value between design and engineering?
So design system, it's actually, the fully developed, let's put it this way, design system usually has its engineering counterpart. And so I think it's crucial to have a support from engineering on that. And engineering is pretty open to adopting a design system approach, because historically the component-based approach is very common in engineering, and it's been there for decades. So I doubt there is any engineering team out there that will tell you that, no, thank you, I don't want you to tell me which component are used in this particular mockup. I would rather figure it out myself. No, we don't need a design system from your end. So yeah, having stressing ROI and having support of engineering would be probably could be a game changers for the organization.
So once you've, I guess, convinced someone of the value of the system, and maybe it's progressing, you're building it, how does that communication of value shift as you move into more of a management or maintenance mode with the system? So it's more established, and now you're trying to convince people that it's worth continuing to invest in. Laura, did you run into that at all?
Yeah, I think it's really easy for design systems as well to be started and kind of dropped and fall away to the side. I think if it's starting to fall away to the side, if you're talking at least relative to the other disciplines who use it, that means that you probably don't work fast enough. Part of the commitment of starting a system is that you're going to be keeping up with the releases and keeping up with the work that people are doing. And so if people aren't using the tool that you're building, you need to reevaluate why you're building that tool and what your intake and share out methods are. And in terms of getting buy-in from senior leadership, I think that ladders back to the same thing. If your product, being your system, isn't creating value, how are you supposed to sell it? So it's all about it's better to address something on a smaller scale and address it well than trying to do everything at once.
And Laura, you bring up a great point that you also have to collect data as you're going along. I think sometimes we get so excited at the prospect of creating a design system or adding in accessibility that we don't benchmark to provide a before and after. We, as folks who work in tech, understand the power of numbers, and some people only understand the power of numbers. So having those, we reduce lines of code by 50%, or our Jira bugs went down, 200 in the whole year, or some stats like that can really help gain that, especially folks who aren't as involved in the production, but can see the value in generating, more buy-in, more revenue, more headcount, et cetera.
Yeah, and adding, apologies. Adding on top of how to justify the further investments in the design system, I think that from the very beginning, it should be very clear for everybody that it's not a one-time action. It's how do we justify investment in the, architecture of the system? It's not something that has been designed once and then you just roll with it. It's something that you have to continuously support. There will be bugs in the design system on both design and engineering, and there will be missynchronizations on both ends. And this is an ongoing process, but as long as it's confirmed by the measurable KPIs, and from our experience, the KPIs, they usually lay in faster prototyping cycle, more realistic prototypes. So in very well-developed design systems, usually experiences can be prototyped directly in live application that is clickable, navigatable, and gives a way much better sense to the researchers and designers and stakeholders of how the future proposed task or product gonna look like how the feature gonna look like. So yeah, and sometimes I guess it's not always directly measurable something. So you cannot tell how much money, how much revenue the shorter iteration on the feature design has brought to the company, and especially if the feature is not very not directly impacting the revenue, right? But still, the execution time of the iteration is pretty measurable KPI, and it's
for sure
pretty straightforward.
Do you mind if I just add one more thing too? And I think it's really important. We talk a lot about measurable KPIs, and we talk about baselining before and we talk about after, but I think it's also really important that you do your due diligence and you do a qualitative approach to it as well. Talk to the people who are using your tool, whether it's in the org that you're at or it's for an external client, like go talk to the people who are using it. How did they like it? Just get some sentiment around it. And I think you have to have that angle to be able to plan ahead what you need to do or change or iterate, combined with the KPIs to tell you whether or not you're being successful from, a numeric data perspective.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, I know we've certainly found that you also have to, it's really important. I like the point of making sure you're measuring from the beginning, because you kind of have to continuously get better. People forget how terrible things used to be. They only know how terrible things currently are. And so if you aren't continuously pushing on top of that and continuing to improve, it can start to feel like your system isn't providing the same value that maybe it did 3 months ago. This might be a good time to start talking about what our systems look like. So Alexis, can you tell me a little bit about the systems team at Splunk?
Yeah, so we still have that new team smell. We're a little over a year old, and we are a team of, I believe, 25 to 28 folks. We're divvied up between design systems, data visualization, and our studio team, which does a little bit more of that engineering connection. So Max stressed the importance of, design and engineering really being partners 100%, and from the accessibility lens as well. My number one hero counterpart, I hope she doesn't get too embarrassed when I say this, is an engineering counterpart in accessibility. So for us, being able to, really brainstorm things or being able to quickly triage is important, and then still working on what we see as the most important thing with design and engineering. We have an old code base and our in progress code base. So a lot of what our designers are dealing with, myself included, is how do you balance, especially in accessibility, remediation versus like building accessibility from the beginning. And there's different tactics that we use for each. In addition, our team does a lot of education and advocacy. We think that, design systems have been around for such a long time. And really that's not necessarily true. There's a lot of people who still don't know like what a design system is or what value it brings, or like how do you make one? So
how would you define the design system? I think it's still quite an open-ended question, and different companies, they understand something like specific to the company by their design system. I mean, that's from our experience. And yeah, just a side note, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's great. Like, not that, thank you. It's great that you brought up the question, not the interrupting. We primarily have a component library, and then we're working on things like adding workflows. I personally believe that there's also needs to be a foundation of just understanding the user. So what kind of documentation and quality can we bring in, say, whether you're a junior UX designer or a UI designer, or you're a principal who's switching industries, like you should be able to not only understand how the components work, but also who you're designing for, right? Like the talk earlier from Haley talked about how our system is only as powerful as the context that we know it to be used in. And that was something that, kind of shook me to my core, to say the least, of like, you can build this immaculate, beautiful system, and if it's not what the user needs to accomplish their goal, then, how successful is it? I went on 50 tangents. That's how I talk. Sorry.
Laura, what does the systems team look like at Loblaw?
So I'm not involved in the larger systems team. Actually, we are doing a rogue system, as I like to call it, for PC Optima, which is the primary product that I'm responsible for. And our roadmaps don't align with the larger team. And so we've gone ahead, and as we redesign our app fully, everything new becomes componentized and rolled into the new system. And so we've been really fortunate to be in a position where, instead of setting it up as a single person's responsibility on the team, all design is working on it together. We're a small team. There's only, I think, 4 of us designers in total, including myself, and a decent number of devs per platform. And so we're all just working together and ingraining it for like 5 to 10% of every product or project, I should say, that we create within it is rolling it into the system. And then from there, we're collaborating outwards with content strategy and the Ally accessibility team to make sure that we're attaching any relative documentation to the work that we're doing. So far it's gone extremely well, and it's been like very fast, very informal, and very nimble. So it's been a nice change from some of the bigger legacy systems I have inherited or big ones I've tried to start. It's been really refreshing to have something small that everyone can just be really on board with, and it's a pretty great little playground.
How did you decide to make that divergence call?
To work on a smaller product?
Or to, I guess, to work outside of the Loblaw system. So you said you're spinning up a different system for this. How did you make that decision?
The Loblaw's design system team is relatively new, and so they're approaching it based on platform. And so they were starting with web, and our prerogative was to start with mobile. So obviously for us to be able to reach our achievements for the year, we had to start with mobile. So, you know, it could end up being a really good relationship. Like hopefully that we're learning and solving some things along the way that are going to be able to be shared back with the larger team. So I'm kind of on the opposite side of the coin that I'm used to, but it's been really fun to move so fast.
So there's the plan to potentially converge in the future if it works out that way?
Ultimately, yeah, everything
Cool.
should be centralized in a single place, but we're also working on some interesting models since we are the loyalty tier. We're a brand that's embedded in other brands. So thinking about how a small system can also be componentized in ways that are built to nest in other branded experiences. So it's kind of an outward model instead of an intake process with us, which is pretty fun, actually.
That's awesome. I'm going to grab one of the audience questions. So Kevin asks if we can talk about how design systems move from design to code. He's interested in the collaboration between designers and developers. Max, do you want to jump in on this?
Sure. So as it being said, it really depends on the context of the company, of the business, of the product. It's very different when you have, let's say, only web application, and you're developing a design system that talks to web components, basically, that's going to be used by the web team. So, and it's pretty common for the web-only companies, and for like to say it in a really basic terms, usually it stands for, okay, we have a Sketch or Figma or Adobe XD library, and that's a design counterpart of the design system, and we have a bunch of React components, which is probably the engineering counterpart of the design system. Sometimes the design counterpart of the system is being completely dropped off, and designers are working directly in React using tools that allow you to do what you see, what you get editing of React components, like if it was a design tool instead. But this is like a very narrow, but at the same time, very common scenario. But there are also companies that have to support multiple platforms, and these are usually web plus mobile. Some companies have to support desktop applications like Mac and Windows, and some companies have to support not only the products that were developed with their current team, but also with some legacy products. Usually the bigger companies that do a lot of acquisitions, they end up with basically a zoo of different products under their supervision, and they have to try to apply this design system to the bunch of the product. They don't really control the tech stack in. They could be written in absolutely different technologies. There could be different cultures within the team, and etc. So the main thing to like what we know, what we learned internally, what we learned from our customers, is finding advocates on both ends. It's not going to work without the advocates in the development team. So there should be someone or a group of people who are very interested in, making the collaboration with the design design department really smooth. And developers, they best understand when they are being spoken in components too. And so as long as there will be an advocate on the development end, there will be an interest from the development team to keep it up in the up-to-date state. And so this is how it works. From the experience when the design system has been enforced from the top and there is no buy-in at the development end, it's going to be a pretty bumpy, I would say, experience, because they're going to be, well, you can expect a lot of pushback on the development end, because usually developers have way much more important things to do than keeping the design system up to date, well,
sure,
for their judgment.
Thanks, Max. Alexis, I'm curious, is the Splunk design system, like, who are the main consumers of that system? Is it purely designers, developers? Are there other disciplines that are also consuming that system?
Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned larger companies and acquisitions, Max, because that's a challenge that our design systems team is running into now. We have 4 companies that have recently come under the Splunk umbrella, and it's how do we align these? Does our system work for all these new use cases? And the tech stacks aren't the same. So how are we going to make sure that these components are usable by everyone, or if we have the need for different modifiers? Something that I've recently learned in working in accessibility is the nomenclature can be extremely challenging between teams. So what Max may think of as a modal, for instance, is not what one of my fellow designers may think of. And they might say, okay, well, here are the 5 designs for a modal. And once I come in with an accessibility lens, I say, ooh, like, these are not all the same modal, because if you do this interaction with a screen reader, you're going to get 5 very different user experiences. And on the dev side, we have to think of different HTML semantics, like different ARIA labels, and it can get kind of messy, honestly. But that's kind of the fun part of being on a design systems team and having these more, complex landscapes to kind of wrestle with.
I can say for my system that our audience is primarily ourselves, but which is always kind of nice and unusual, as well as our developers and our writers. But we also deal with a fair number of vendors who end up touching the work. So it's also kind of an onboarding tool for them, and providing some direction when we're not able to be there, as any good system should. But on top of that, very close knit with our developers, and everything down to our naming conventions we do together. So our idealized state is to kind of just have everything collected in one place that our brand has, that has a digital footprint, whether or not it's something that we technically own, just so there's a single resource that people can go to find what they need, and we can have a bird's eye view on it to make sure that everything we're doing is designed correctly and designed well and designed accessibly.
I think the accessibility point is so interesting, because we've certainly run into this on Polaris a ton, but I'm very curious how, and I'm sure, Alexis, you have lots of opinions about this, but how you plan for accessibility and inclusion in your systems, and how you think about what it means to make both a system accessible and then the products that consume those things accessible.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. For a little bit of context setting, because I feel like words like accessibility, diversity, inclusion are very buzzwordy. So how I define accessibility is, pure compliance. Do you meet your WCAG, your 508? If you have a VPAT that's come back with things that you need to fix, do you fix them? Versus inclusion, which I see as, ensuring that your product experience is clear, efficient, and even pleasant for people of all abilities. So kind of defining that sort of hierarchical standard. I have a mentor at Airbnb, Michael Suey, who talks to me about things that at the base you have, it's inaccessible, then it's accessible, then it's user-friendly, and then at the top it's innovative. So I like debunking the myth that just because it's accessible doesn't mean it's innovative. I think there's such an unexplored territory of that mixture, or that, compromise at synchronicity, that we're just not there yet, because there's not a lot of focus on accessibility until it's too late or you're in the remediation stage. So, for me, it's getting there and just being like, yo, is it accessible? And also acknowledging that our biggest, I think, downfall as designers is that a lot of people think accessibility is just colors and fonts. And that's not the case at all. There's so many different areas within design and engineering that can make something super accessible or inclusive. And even then you may have the intent of, I want to make this product accessible, and it may not be user-friendly. So something I found doing testing with my engineering counterpart is developers often put in ARIA labels. sounds great. It's accessible. However, what happens when you have parent-child relationships and nestled ARIA labels is that a screen reader will read you 10 ARIA labels in a row, which is not a good experience for someone who, may be hard of hearing. And I say like the equivalent for us would be like, the Comic Sans rainbow epilepsy inducing 1990s sites. Like it's that for your ears. And that, it's accessible, but it's not a great experience. So I would say, get to a point where you can be confident enough and, the site's accessible. We can go through it with keyboard interactions only. Maybe we can go through it with a screen reader. We've tested it and, 80% of the site is good. And then move towards, okay, now how do we make this, pleasant for folks? How do we, get people who identify as differently abled in part of our product experience and are testing with us and are giving us feedback? Because oftentimes, like, we're not the ones who are going to deal with our design and engineering efforts. And we need to understand from, the community, are we being, the inclusive and accessible product that we market ourselves as?
And Alexis, I do have a question for you. Like, kind of the stance I always take with accessibility, especially when you inherit a product that isn't, is my stance has always been like, you just draw a line and you're like, as of today, everything we're doing is going to be AA compliant and more inclusive. So taking that approach where you're just doing everything forward, quote, the right way, what flags would you say to watch out for?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Something I'm learning with the design team I'm working with and engineering is that we as designers have a lot of power in terms of designing for accessibility. Like one interview I was doing with the engineer, he said, I'm not going to be looking for color contrast or font legibility. I expect that to already be built into the design. And I don't discover that until it's in testing or it's in production where it's much more costly. So I'm pretty sure this has been said, but the IBM example of like fixing a bug in production is like 100 times more expensive than catching it in the design process. Like that's a lot of ownership and like potential ability on us to, so I would say colors and fonts, definitely. If you're a visual designer, look for things like alt text. Are you providing icon names? Because if I read something with a screen reader and it's nothing, and that happens to be, the second most important action on the screen, what happens to, a no vision or low vision user? Things like that. And, I break things down in terms of colors and fonts, like, yes, we can do that. More like extensive visual design. I think something we get caught up in is in terms of UX design is thinking of what is our zooming experience? What are, like performance? I think everyone working remotely has had this issue where they're like, ooh, my Wi-Fi is not as good as this place that it is in the office. That is a portion of accessibility. What's your first to print? What's your first to define? If something doesn't load, how do you surface that error to a user, even if it's like the last panel of a dashboard? And there's a lot of other resources I could go on and on about it. But to your point, colors, fonts, and just having that awareness and checking it, because I acknowledge that accessibility design is still kind of a new field and you may not have subject matter experts, but that doesn't mean that you as a designer can't do something about it and start becoming an accessibility champion in your organization.
Sure. Laura, you touched on something interesting there, which is the fact that you can often inherit a bunch of work that you maybe didn't have any input into whatsoever, but now all of a sudden you either need to turn it into a system or you need to turn it into something that you wish was a system. And Rebecca's asked an interesting question, which I think is similar, about managing and evolving a design system that's already in use with 40 plus designers. Like, you used to work in banks. I'm sure you encountered a lot of legacy systems there. Can you speak a little bit to how you maybe brought systems thinking to those spaces?
Yeah, when you inherit whether it be a system or a product that's inherently not where you want it to be for a number of reasons, whether that's accessibility or design or whatnot. I think kind of the first thing you have to make sure that you do when you take a look at it is to be empathetic to the people who built it. It sounds a little cliche, but understand that probably some of the things that you would prefer to change are there for a reason, and hopefully those reasons don't exist anymore. So it's important to inherit it with kindness. But from there is to evaluate it and prioritize. Just document everything you see, whether it be the product or the system itself, and see what strikes you as the largest overarching problems across the components or the methods that you're seeing. And then from there to do a simple comparison of those against the level of effort versus the things that are, more non-optional, like accessibility, compliance. And from there, just start to prioritize what you want to change. But it's really important along the way that you're not prioritizing things because of your preference, that you're prioritizing things because they're detrimental to the experience of the user. So it's really, really tough, especially when, everyone wants what they work on to be the best, but you have to really push yourself to kind of get out of your head a little bit and to stop thinking quite so much as the designer and to think of this as a tool for a product and what's going to have the greatest impact in the shortest period of time and what is hurting the business.
Nice. So I'm very curious, maybe you're all using the same model, maybe it's different, but what is the contribution model you use for your systems teams? There's lots of different ones. Maybe we could start with Max, I'm not sure.
I don't know, like we are, despite the fact that we do tools for, like, I think that this is an open-ended question about about the terminology. So
yeah, I think it's more like if you're thinking about, if we shift gears to managing design systems, like how do you make sure that your system is well managed across your team?
So yeah, first of all, the approach we are trying to follow internally is that we try not to over-design stuff, and we add things to the common system when they're needed, actually. And being a smaller team, we have a luxury of it, despite the fact that we have a variety of products on the different platforms. So they're not completely compliant with the design system because it's really hard to track, in fact, but our design system is more like a recommendation, and that's what we see in, well, probably a vast majority of the organizations that have a number of products that they produce. So yeah, and the management is I think the biggest challenge about the design system is how to keep it how to keep it equally developed on both ends of the spectrum. And so there are several approaches there. There are several, well, verticals. So first of all, there should be an engineering representation of the design system. There should be design representation of the system. The validation of the actual application or product that has been built on top of the design system. It really depends on the team how strict you want to go and what should be the percentage of the compliance with the design counterpart of the design system. It's one thing, and another thing is that not really a lot of people are talking about is that design systems are basically to a certain degree, they are a component framework used in the engineering, and with any single component framework, you immediately step into the dependency management kind of task. So imagine this, you have a design system and you have 127 different products in your company. So this is like a real number from one of our conversations with the design teams at the larger organization. And even if you have a design system in place, and even if all of those 127 products were developed according to the design system and based on this design system, some of the products were probably developed a year ago and they are behind in their design system, in the version of the design system they use. And some of the products are using the mainstream upstream version of the design system. So, and immediately, in order to maintain those projects and products, as a design team, you will have to manage various, branches, if you will, of the design system on both engineering and design side. So again, I would hate to give any specific advices here because it's very, very unique. So the only advice I could give is that just don't don't do the design system management things. Like don't be religious about it. It's to my mind, this is not the goal. The goal is to make life easier, not more difficult. And as long as the team can agree that the stuff that they have in place right now actually makes sense and helps them to achieve their goals, that's an example of a great and working design system for me. So, and
yeah, I'm curious how that changes, Alexis. I think you said you had 28 people on your design systems team. Is that right? How does that perspective change as your systems team grows and the ownership of that system shifts? I'm sure that the overall Splunk team must be a lot bigger than that then.
Sure, it is.
Yeah.
I think something we can't speak too much in terms of management because we're still so young and fledgling. So we're working more on like an ad hoc basis. So my advice is like to meet the needs of your partners and stakeholders. Like don't, one size solution doesn't fit all. I think one interesting point to bring up is if you're on a cloud-based product, like your updates, CI/CD can go like flashy, they're ready, it's up to date. If you work for an enterprise company and things are on premise, you may not have people who update for 1 to 2 years. So what does that say for your design system? Like you're always going to have some sort of V1, V2. So like there's different challenges based on industry, company size. We found that our ad hoc management model works well right now because again, the main challenge is a lot of folks don't know what a design system is. So we meet our partners where they are, and whether that's education or being able to work with the engineering team and say like, okay, these are the specs that we're thinking of, or working with designers and be like, where is this breaking? Like, are we covering majority of the use cases? Do we need a new component or do we want to add a modification to something? And just, like Max said, being flexible, like, especially when you're in a larger company that has acquisitions or there's an international pandemic that happens and, everything gets flipped upside down. Like you can't adhere to like one specific route.
Great. Laura, is the contribution model at Loblaw any different?
On my team, yeah, we have a really interesting one going on. We're kind of viewing our design system as being a lot more than just the actual components. We are also branching out and consolidating with the digital team-wide content guidelines so that we're making sure that we're writing inclusively, we're writing properly. So we have some great talent working on that we're incorporating into what we're doing, but we're also working closely with the marketing brand team. And so we're viewing this as a larger touch point than just perhaps digital product. And so taking a look at how we can translate these artifacts that, we're all familiar with, brand books created for print, and we got to figure out what to do with them. So working together to translate that into something that actually works in a digital space and to work on a new variant of that together. So it's been really nice to see the connection coming together between product design and traditional marketing brand, because I feel like it's always such a difficult relationship wherever I am. And I think it's a really fun way to work. So our contribution model is very loose. Pretty much if someone has something relative to our product and we take a look at it and we work together to align it to the styles, and then we'll put it in because we want to have a view of everywhere that it's being integrated and all the ways that it's being expressed so that we can help to manage it and facilitate it and share it with the other teams who might need to pick it up. So yeah, I guess we do intake a little bit more than I thought we did, but it's surprisingly effective. But again, we're very casual about it. We don't have formal releases. And for us, we find that it's working really well at the scale that we're functioning at, and everyone knows where to find us, or at least how to message us now on Slack. Yeah.
And Laura, if I could amplify a point that you said, like writing and your content should be part of your design system. I have found from friends from different companies that it's kind of a over the wall, like, okay, give me some words and I'll plug them in. But part of inclusion design is also thinking about, our international markets. How does your internationalization go? How is your localization? How is your translation? Are, you making sure that things are translating well? Are you just plugging it into Google Translate and hope that it is what it is? Because we've had a few like cute, non-harmful blunders where we're like, oh, that was not what we were intending to say. Like a button may not translate compared to a button on a shirt, and you're like, oh God, that doesn't look great. So love that. And, definitely thinking about words as much as pixels and images and components in your design system.
It's really, really challenging. And I mean, content strategy is such a great topic right now, especially for inclusive design. And it's really, really important that when you're laying down your baseline components, that even in the example, that content is correct, especially in terms of your formatting, your label styles. And if people are creating variables, if you have primary CTAs, put your rules right next to them from the content guidelines, to try and no one wants designers to be writing, but if they have to, let's try and mitigate some of the damage.
Nice. I just glanced at the time and I realized that we are basically out. So I just wanted to thank everybody for their comments on this. I think it's been a really great conversation. Hopefully everybody who's listening enjoyed it. If people have questions, maybe we could just end by like saying if you're open to have people reach out via email or not. Yeah, and if so, I'm sure we can facilitate that some way with the group. But thanks again, Alexis, Laura, and Max. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kyle, and all the panelists, of course. That was an amazing panel discussion.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. And I think it's interesting there's so many different design systems out there and so many different ways to manage it and encourage collaboration. It's really interesting to hear different viewpoints.
Absolutely.